It's 10 a.m. here in Washington. I'm Jim Sciutto. Poppy has the day off. Our breaking news this morning is a run-in between U.S. and Russian warships, a very close call in the Philippine Sea. This morning, each nation accusing the other of deliberately, recklessly causing a near collision between a Russian destroyer and the U.S. Chancellorsville, a guided missile cruiser. But video from the Chancellorsville, and seen first here on CNN, shows the Russian ship coming up to it very close. This while the U.S. ship was taking in a helicopter. It's a vulnerable time in a ship's maneuvers here. This appears to be a very aggressive act by Russia. CNN's Barbara Starr has been covering the story from the beginning. Tell us how dangerous this is. I mean, you said earlier U.S. sailors could almost reach out and touch this Russian ship as it came up close.
Well, that's right, Jim. I mean, let's keep playing the video for everyone to look at. You can see how close the two decks, the two hulls of these ships came to each other. And the reason the U.S. Navy says that this was the responsibility of the Russians to act in a safe manner, which they did not in the U.S. Navy view, when you look at that image, there is a wake, a very high-speed wake. The wake will show in another still image that the Russians made a sharp turn towards the U.S. Navy ship and came up alongside it. The U.S. Navy ship clearly in front, came alongside at a high speed. That's how you get a wake like that. And this is not safe practice, the Navy very strongly feels. In fact, the commander of this Navy ship had to then issue an order instantly to put into reverse at full speed to get away from the Russian ship, which came, by Navy estimates, in 50 to 100 feet of the U.S. ship. That still image, you can see that sharp turn wake by the Russian ship on the left-hand side of your screen. The Navy is very adamant that they had the right of way because they were trying to land a helicopter on the deck. And of course, when you do this at sea, you have to maintain a steady course. They were not in a position to make sudden moves. The helicopter was waved off. It didn't land while the Navy was forced to make the moves to maneuver away from this Russian warship. The Navy very concerned about this incident, Jim.
Barbara, and I liked how you noted earlier that as that ship pulls away, you see it there, you have Russian sailors sunbathing on the back of that Russian destroyer. Seemed to be a little bit of a message there as well. Barbara Starr at the Pentagon, thanks very much. Let's bring in retired Air Force Colonel and CNN military analyst Cedric Leighton. So when you watch this happen there, I mean, it seems the video is pretty clear cut. You have the U.S. ship sailing and the Russian ship kind of comes in like this. Doesn't leave much doubt as to what was the act of aggression here. That's not by accident.
Not at all, Jim. And in fact, when you know something about naval maneuvers, this is the kind of distance that a ship would have when it's undergoing replenishment operations, when they're resupplying a vessel at sea. And I've watched those. I've been on board U.S. naval vessels when those have happened. And those are very intricate maneuvers. This is something, when you look at that video and you see exactly how close the Russians came, it's an extremely dangerous maneuver, because what the Russians are doing is they're in essence challenging the U.S. not only in the military sense, but also in terms of seamanship. They're going after the capabilities of the U.S. Navy. They're testing the capabilities of the U.S. Navy, and they're trying to figure out, what our responses would be in a case like this.
This is the point, and it's a good point you make, because when this happens, beyond sending a message there right down to the sailors, the Russian sailors sunbathing on the back of the ship, is they're testing response times, reactions in the moment, but also bigger picture. In other words, what does the U.S., what does President Trump do in response to this? What should the president do?
Absolutely. They're testing the entire chain of command, from the tactical event of the ships coming so close together all the way up to what the National Command Authority, meaning President Trump, ultimately are going to do in a case like this. So they want to see what our response times are, what our diplomatic responses are, as well as our military responses. Are we going to send more ships into the Pacific? Are we going to send more planes? Are we going to do something like back off in certain areas? Those are all the kinds of things that they're looking at, and they feel that they want to know exactly how we're making this happen.
Well, there's the president there. These are live pictures from Shannon, Ireland, as the president prepares to leave Europe, head back to the U.S. Of course, there with the First Lady, President wearing a USA cap. Shannon is a typical stopping off point for U.S. planes, including Air Force One, when they cross the Atlantic. This marking the end of the president's trip to the U.K. And to Normandy, of course, to mark the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings there. We will come back to this if the president chooses to speak to reporters. Doesn't look, at least at this point, that he's going to do that, but we'll stay on top of it. Meanwhile, still here with Cedric Leighton. Final question. If this is a test, and it is a test, Russia of the U.S., what would you like to see the president do in response?
I'd want him to be very resolute. I would want him to make it very clear to the Russians, first diplomatically, but also send military signals by deploying perhaps more ships and some airplanes, perhaps for reconnaissance flights against Russian targets. And they could be anywhere. They don't necessarily have to be in the Pacific, but they need to send a message to the Russians that this kind of behavior is unacceptable.
Cedric Leighton, thanks very much. Folks, I've written a book about this. It's called The Shadow War. This is part of a larger strategy by Russia and China to undermine the U.S., test U.S. limits militarily, in cyberspace, in space, happening right now. If you're interested in that topic, it's worth a read. To Capitol Hill now, where House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is still holding firm against beginning an impeachment inquiry of the president. That is despite a strong and detailed argument behind closed doors from one of her most powerful members. That is the Judiciary Committee Chairman, Jerry Nadler. Sina's Manu Raju uncovered some previously unknown details of a private meeting earlier this week, and a private, I guess you could call it, clash, really, between the chairman of the Judiciary Committee and the Speaker of the House.
Yeah, behind the scenes, Jerry Nadler has been trying to make the case to Nancy Pelosi to back off her resistance to opening up an impeachment probe. Publicly, Jerry Nadler has been very cautious, has not gone that far, but privately is a different story, including in this meeting this week with Nancy Pelosi and other chairmen of key committees. He made the case that this would help. Opening up an impeachment inquiry would help their legal arguments in court, fighting with the Trump administration over a range of matters, saying that they could argue to the federal courts that this information must be turned over to Congress because they're in the middle of an impeachment inquiry. They fear losing one of those court cases could dramatically set back their efforts to investigate President Trump. But also, Jerry Nadler arguing that investigation, impeachment inquiry could centralize all the sprawling investigations in the House into one committee, his committee, to investigate potential criminal conduct of this president, freeing up those other committees to do legislation. That also got pushed back, not just from Pelosi, but also Adam Schiff, the House Intelligence Committee chairman, who's doing his own investigation. So at the moment, Jerry Nadler is making this quiet case to Pelosi, but not getting very far, Jim.
Manu, what Nadler is trying to do here is fight what seems to be the White House strategy, which is to send everything to court, drag it out, maybe even beyond 2020. He wants to streamline that process to get courts to enforce subpoenas more quickly. Explain that. Yeah,
very quickly. This is a significant change in the efforts to ratchet up these fight with the administration. What they're going to do next week on the House floor is approve a resolution that would allow all congressional committees in the House to essentially take their fights to court to enforce their subpoenas. What that essentially would do is that would avoid a vote on the full House floor to compel a court proceeding. Now, these chairmen could initiate the court proceedings themselves. That could dramatically escalate the fights between the Trump administration and the House Democrats. As Democrats have been concerned, they've been going too slow in pushing these matters in court, Jim.
Manu Raju on the Hill, thanks very much. Let's discuss now with CNN political analyst Sabrina Siddiqui and CNN political director David Chalian. David, where does this all go? I mean, it's coming out in public. I mean, it's still what is it, about 60, I think, Democrats who've come out publicly in support of impeachment.
Which we should note is about a quarter of the entire Democratic caucus.
Exactly. Yeah. But they're very public. They're gaining in number.
Exactly.
Is this sort of a, irreversible momentum in that direction?
Well, I don't know that. Nancy Pelosi seems to, I think, have her finger on the pulse of where the country is on this right now, and certainly where her caucus is as well. I really do think that as we continue to watch who joins the pro-impeachment movement, that becomes critical. If it is people that are coming from these Republican districts that just delivered the majority to the Democrats, if some of these folks who just ousted Republicans, they're freshman Democrats, if they were to start getting more and more calls for impeachment, I think Speaker Pelosi would pay a different kind of attention to that.
Have you seen any in that category yet?
But, well, you've seen some that may be in favor, but not of the real most endangered Democratic incumbents. Not many of them are taking this position, and that's what Nancy Pelosi worries about.
President Trump, this is not unusual, has made this personal between himself and Nancy Pelosi, and he brought that even to the D-Day commemoration ceremonies in France during an interview, Fox News, in an American war dead cemetery. I want to play the clip and get your reaction.
I think she's a disgrace. I actually don't think she's a talented person. I've tried to be nice to her because I would have liked to have gotten some deals done. She's incapable of doing deals. She's a nasty, vindictive, horrible person.
I mean, you see the crosses behind his head as he makes that very personal attack there. Important? Troubling?
Well, I think it's what we've come to expect from this president. The old rule that politics stops at the water's edge is simply not a rule that he has followed. He's not the only president who has engaged in some variation of domestic politics while overseas, but especially on the commemoration of D-Day, it was particularly striking that he would engage once again in these very personal attacks, not just against House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, but also Special Counsel Robert Mueller. And I think that reinforces the ways in which Nancy Pelosi in particular has really gotten under his skin. And so he can't help himself. This is, of course, it's worth remembering, a president who will take really any opportunity that's given to him to attack his political opponents. Doesn't really matter what the forum or the setting is. We've seen that trend time and again over the last couple of years. But it does show that he's increasingly bothered by the specter of Democrats really amplifying their investigations and sort of coming to this potentially tipping point on impeachment. And I think that's why you see the White House really trying to stonewall those investigative efforts. And that in turn is really what's leading a lot of these Democrats to just run out of patience and tell Pelosi that, look, there has to be another way.
It's a classically petty Trump insult, right, to go after the person's talent, vindictive, horrible, this kind of thing. I mean, let's just set that aside because we've heard it before. But on the politics of this, who's getting better of the Trump versus Pelosi battle here?
Well, remember here, Nancy Pelosi, who, when asked, did not, while on foreign soil, want to deal with impeachment, but right before she arrived on foreign soil, she had said she'd rather see the president in prison than impeached. So there is an amping up of the rhetoric from Speaker Pelosi as well. And I think that's a deliberate strategic move because she doesn't want to move to impeachment.
Yep.
If she amps up her rhetoric, she shows her folks that are in favor of impeachment, listen, I am with you in this fight to take down Donald Trump. I just don't think it should be impeachment. So I think she wants to keep her caucus of the mind that, no, she's the right fighter for us right now, even if we're not totally aligned on how that fight should be fought.
Like she used the word cover-up last week in the midst of another dispute within the caucus. I wonder, the conventional wisdom is that because impeachment helped Bill Clinton's popularity in the 90s, that impeachment would be a political mistake for the Democrats and would help Donald Trump. But essentially, I heard Jeffrey Toobin on the air yesterday. He's like, is it really good to be impeached as president, become the third American president or impeached? I guess Nixon resigned before he was actually impeached. What are the politics of impeachment going forward, at least impeachment proceedings?
Well, look, I think that so far polling has shown that the majority of Americans are not yet there on impeachment. It still is somewhat of a divisive issue, and that's what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is telling her caucus, that, look, pursuing impeachment plays directly into the president's hands, allows himself to cast himself as a victim, especially as he gears up for re-election. But then the argument, of course, many others are making is Congress should not be making these decisions based on political calculations.
Congress making decisions on political calculations?
They have a responsibility to conduct and carry out oversight. And the more Nancy Pelosi does amp up this rhetoric and say, look, I think he belongs in prison, I don't think he's fit to serve, the more it also at the same time sort of undermines the argument she's making, because then a lot of people then move to say, well, why aren't you at least formally launching an impeachment inquiry?
It's a purely political calculation that she's making.
Impeachment's a political process, right? I mean, it's interesting to hear the rhetoric. It's almost identical from Democrats here versus Republicans against Bill Clinton. I mean, you could almost like lift the speeches out and drop them into the sound bites. But anyway, this is Washington. David Chalian, Sabrina Siddiqui, thanks very much. There is new hope that those tariffs on Mexico may not go into effect on Monday. The Trump administration saying just moments ago that the president could choose to cancel them in the final hours. That is, if he sees progress, but what has to happen first. Plus, 2020 frontrunner Joe Biden reversing course about federal funding for abortion. This after facing backlash from several other presidential hopefuls. We're going to speak to a senior advisor for the Biden campaign. And a couple says they became violently sick at the same resort in the Dominican Republic where 3 Americans mysteriously died. Hear their story just ahead. Negotiations still ongoing fail, but just moments ago, the vice president's chief of staff said that President Trump will have the final say.
As negotiations continued yesterday, we were more encouraged that they came forward with some of the things that we put on the table Wednesday to say they were open to that. But, Kristen, there's a long way to go still. That's the bottom line. There's a legal notification that goes forward today with the plan to implement tariffs on Monday. But I think that there is the ability, if negotiations continue to go well, that the president can turn that off at some point over the weekend.
Joining me now to discuss this standoff is Ambassador Jeffrey Davidow. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, as well as to Venezuela and Zambia. Good morning, Ambassador. Thank you for taking the time this morning.
Good morning, Jim. Good to be with you.
So first, big picture, if I could get at what is the Trump strategy here, and it's not the first time they've done it, is to use tariffs because of a non-economic issue, the immigration issue here. I mean, like you saw them use national security justification for tariffs, for instance, on U.S. ally Canada regarding steel. Is that problematic for a U.S. president to be connecting tariffs as a tool with national security priorities here, particularly with a close ally?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake, and I think it has real opportunity to wind up having us shoot ourselves in the foot, especially when we talk about Mexico, Jim. You know, if you look at the immigration from Mexico, that is the number of Mexicans who have left Mexico in recent years, that number is way down from what it was 10 or 20 years ago. In fact, right now, it's net zero when we talk about Mexicans. And that's because the Mexican economy has improved. The Mexican economy has improved because we have this free trade agreement. And to start fooling around with that really runs the risk that that economy could suffer and the number of immigrants, Mexican immigrants, could increase.
Yeah, I mean, you're making a good point here, because the increased number of asylum seekers aren't coming from Mexico, who is being threatened with punishment here. They're coming from Central American countries. So the U.S. is basically making Mexico be the buffer, I suppose you could say, between the U.S. and Central America.
Well, that's correct. Of course, it's a natural geographic buffer. And Mexico has to take some responsibility as well. But certainly, I think the aim of the administration is to put more weight and more responsibility on Mexico.
But isn't this just pushing the problem further south? Because the reason, you got to reason these folks are fleeing Honduras, Guatemala, and elsewhere. You got enormous violence there. Plus, of course, there's an economic incentive to go north. But this is an administration, of course, that has cut aid to those countries that might address some of those issues. I mean, does it solve the problem to move it further south from the U.S. border rather than address the root causes?
Well, I think it might solve the immediate political problem in the United States, but the root causes are not being addressed.
Right.
I think there's also the possibility that if a new system is put in place, as the press seems to be indicating, in which people from these countries would have to apply for asylum in Mexico, it does appear that perhaps there would be fewer who would want to come. I think what we've seen in the last few months is that the word has spread in Central America that if you can make it to the U.S. border, there's a good chance you're going to be let in. So change in asylum policy may change the flow.
Right, and that's something that Congress, and they share responsibility. They haven't been willing or able to do yet to change those essential laws here. But I wonder, because, and this may be getting, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but it strikes me as interesting that the U.S., I think, to make this work, does it not have to declare Mexico and even Guatemala as safe countries? In other words, for these asylum seekers to be held in while they pursue their case. Is that not a tough argument to make in light of the violence and so on in both of those countries?
I don't think it's that tough, Jim. Yes, of course, there is violence in both of those countries. But Mexico, which is a country of, 120, 130 million people, has the 99% of the population goes to work every day, goes to school every day. Sure, they're aware of the violence. I don't think it would be that much of a stretch to say it's a safe country.
All right, Ambassador Jeffrey Davidow, it's good to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Former Vice President, and of course 2020 frontrunner, Joe Biden, reversing course on a long-held position on federal funding for abortion. So why the change? We're going to ask a senior member of his campaign. That's coming up. with a major policy reversal on abortion, this in the wake of widespread criticism from his own party. After defending the Hyde Amendment for years, Biden reversed course Thursday, saying he can no longer support the law which blocks federal funds from being used for most abortions. Here's what he said.
I make no apologies for my last position, and I make no apologies for what I'm about to say. I can't justify leaving millions of women without access to the care they need and the ability to exercise their constitutionally protected right. If I believe health care is a right, as I do, I can no longer support an amendment that makes that right dependent on someone's zip code.
I'm pleased to be joined now by Symone Sanders. She is a senior advisor to the Biden campaign. Symone, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me on today.
So, Symone, I want to play what the co-chair of the Biden campaign, Congressman Cedric Richmond, said on CNN just a couple of days ago regarding Biden's position on this, and get your reaction. Have a listen.
I think the vice president has been very consistent over his career in the Senate since '76 when the Hyde Amendment became law, that he is a deeply religious man. I think everyone knows that, and he's guided by his faith. And his position on the Hyde Amendment has been consistent.
Deeply religious man, guided by his faith, but now making this reversal. How do you reconcile that statement with this change?
Well, Jim, there's nothing to reconcile. First, Congressman Richmond was absolutely correct. What you heard the vice president say last night, though, is that as we're working through our health care plan, the details of our health care plan, he cannot justify locking out millions of women from coverage based upon their zip code.
Yeah,
that's where this is coming
but for
from.
years,
so I know
he's held a position that blocks out those women based on their zip code, justifying it by saying this is part of his religious beliefs, which is a fair argument to make. It's just that it's odd to say this is so deeply held, religious, emotional, philosophical, and then say, well, actually, no longer.
Well, I don't think he said no longer. Look, I was with the vice president all day yesterday. We were in Atlanta. We did a range of events. We had a number of meetings. We met with local community leaders. And as he was working through his remarks for yesterday evening, he was very, very clear that this is a deeply personal thing for him. But he's also very clear that he believes in making sure folks across the country have access. We talk a lot about the middle class on our campaign, Jim. And when we talk about the middle class, we are talking about a middle class that includes everyone, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, whether you're gender nonconforming, whether you are gay, straight, LGBTQ, whether you pray to Jesus or Buddha. And so I think understanding that that is our position, that is who Joe Biden is, that is the kind of campaign he's running. When we're talking about access to health care, when we're working through our health care plan, he made a very logical decision. Now, Jim, I also want to address something else that I've been hearing last night and this morning.
Before we get to it, I do want to give you an opportunity. I'm just saying, you know, politicians change positions during campaigns, sometimes after being president, or sitting in other seats of government here, but it's when, you know, on policy issues, but when you change something that you held for decades and you justify in deeply personal terms, I just wonder if this raises questions about the vice president's other positions through the years, and will he make changes as well? And what do you say to voters who might say, well, wait a second, I'm not sure where he stands now if he's willing to change a position like that?
Well, Jim, that's what I was just about to address. That's what I've been hearing this morning. There's some folks who want to talk about the vice president's authenticity. Let me tell you something. I liken what the vice president said last night about, again, reinforcing his support for a women's right to choose, reinforcing his support of Roe, and understanding the existential crisis that we're in across the country as Republican governors have failed to expand Medicaid for millions of people, and as Republican legislatures are cracking down on the rights of women, and they are literally assaulting women in places from when it comes to laws, from places from Georgia all the way up to all the way over to Louisiana, Ohio. There's something in the legislature right now, North Carolina and Missouri. This is likened to where the vice president ended up landing on marriage equality. You know, so I want to push back and you know, if the vice president was bending to the whims of a number of my liberal activist friends, he would have came out for Medicare for all last night. But you heard him talk about a public option. So he's authentic. Voters know who Joe Biden is. He is someone that has these deeply personal held beliefs. He's someone that believes in connecting with people, but he's also somebody that believes in listening. And I think voters can expect that he is going to be the same Joe Biden. He's the same Joe Biden last night that he is today. Somebody that's listening, somebody who's authentic, and that's what you're going to continue to hear from him on the campaign trail, Jim.
We know that women voters are going to play a big part in the Democratic primaries, but also in the general election. And clearly the abortion issue, particularly as you have these GOP laws in GOP states going through blocking all access to abortion, is going to be a big issue. And I'm just curious if the vice president was concerned that other Democratic candidates for the nomination were winning on this issue and that he had to catch up, in effect.
Jim, I think there are a number of other candidates vying for the Democratic nomination that are worried about Joe Biden, but who Joe Biden is worried about is the American people. And as I noted earlier, and I will reinforce again for anyone that has a question, that his stance on Hyde, his now not supporting the amendment, is about access. And if we are running a campaign that says we believe in rebuilding the middle class, that's a middle class. We're talking about everybody. And so that middle class absolutely includes women. That middle class absolutely includes specifically women of color, includes white folks, includes black people, Asian American, Pacific Islander. That's what this is about. And so he's working through the details of his health care plan, which I know folks are looking for our health care plan. You're going to see it soon. This is something that he felt the need to address. Joe Biden is not worried about what any of these other Democratic contenders have to say, but he is concerned with making sure that the American people understand that he hears them and that he understands the existential crisis that we're in. I want to say one more thing, Jim. People might forget that the one time in the last, I would say, 50 years that Democrats took on a Republican Supreme Court nomination and won was Bork. And guess who led that fight? It was Joe Biden. And that was a fight specifically about Roe, and that was a fight specifically about women's rights and their right to choose. So if anybody has a question about where Joe Biden stands, I guarantee you he stands strongly on the side of women in this country.
Symone Sanders, senior advisor to the Biden campaign, also a former colleague of mine as a CNN commentator here. Thanks very much. We look forward to keeping up the conversation.
Thanks, Jim.
Coming up at 11 o'clock Eastern Time, Kate Baldwin will talk to Senator Bernie Sanders, also happens to be running for president. It's going to be live. Stay with CNN. This morning, surprising number showing the health of the economy. Only 75,000 jobs added in May. That is less than half of what was forecast. What does this mean for the economy going forward? Is it a warning sign? We'll have more. 75,000 jobs in May. That is well below what experts had forecast. That report also revised down numbers from the previous 2 months, subtracting 75,000 jobs as well. But the markets do not seem to mind, at least not yet. The Dow up about 1%. Joining me now, Ken Rogoff, former chief economist for the International Monetary Fund, now a professor of economics at a little place up north called Harvard. Ken, thank you for taking the time this morning.
Hey, thank you.
So what do you see going on here? I mean, I imagine the markets are up because they're probably thinking an interest rate cut may be coming on the way. But when you connect the dots, below forecast here, revising downward the previous 2 months, concerns about manufacturing jobs, other signs on the bond yield curve, do you see warning signs of a slowing economy?
Well, I don't think there's any question this report should be of concern. I mean, the best guess is we're not going to go into recession, but the idea that President Trump can just do whatever he wants, putting in these trade tariffs, even on our friends and neighbors, Mexico, randomly, unpredictably, it affects business sentiment. And I think we're probably going to see it in the numbers, if not because of that, if not this time going forward. I'm certainly concerned.
Is that principally about the tariff threat? I know that's, I mean, even some of the president's own economic advisors, Kevin Hassett said on our broadcast that tariffs would have an economic cost. Is it largely the tariffs, or is it also that we're 10 years into an economic expansion and these things come to an end, like everything?
You know, honestly, who knows? Productivity's actually been picking up a little bit. The economy, you know, the trend the last couple of years has been positive. But you're absolutely right. I mean, going forward, given our slow growth of the labor force, given productivity hasn't been that strong, unless productivity picks up, we're not going to keep growing at 2.5% and 3%. Yeah. I'm optimistic it could go on for longer, but not with this kind of trade craziness.
Yeah. Let me ask you this then, because now the Federal Reserve Chairman is telegraphing the possibility of cutting rates, justifying it in part based on the negative economic impact of tariffs being imposed on Mexico. I wonder, from your view, I mean, is he in effect enabling the president's policy here? Because the president can say, I'm going to use tariffs and I can count on the Fed to bail me out.
Well, he can count on the Fed to bail him out, except if something goes wrong, the plan is for Trump to blame the Fed, so who knows. You know, they just try to play the cards as they see them on the table, and this hugely raises uncertainty. I think the most recent one on Mexico is just at a whole nother level. With China, you can kind of understand it, but with Mexico, he just signed an agreement. The president of Mexico had just sent it to his parliament, and now he's tearing it up and saying he's going to do something else. It's a whole nother level of unpredictability.
I think folks, they forget that this happens on so, and with America's closest allies, right? It happened, Canada, the EU, etc. Tariff threats.
Yeah, this is Mexico. It's not China.
Yep. Ken Rogoff, good to have you on the program.
Thank you.
A Colorado couple is claiming that they became violently ill at the very same resort in the Dominican Republic where 3 Americans died just days apart. What they believe made them sick is coming up. Principe Resort in La Romana. 41-year-old Miranda Schaup-Werner collapsed and died May 25th. Just 5 days later, Edward Nathaniel Holmes and Cynthia Ann Day were found dead in their room. Meanwhile, we are hearing from a Colorado woman who says that she stayed at the very same resort and that the circumstances surrounding those 3 deaths sound eerily similar to what she and her boyfriend experienced. CNN's Drew Griffin joins us now. He spoke with the couple. Drew, they describe symptoms, becoming violently ill while staying at that resort. What did they tell you?
Jim, they're questioning whether or not what happened to them could be a key in determining what happened to these 3 Americans who are now dead at this very same resort. This really was, for them, a dream vacation turned nightmare, and the nightmare will not stop. Kaylin reached out to CNN almost immediately after learning 3 Americans believe
boiling. It's too coincidental with the symptoms that we had and begin to stay quiet.
Resort La Romana, and for the first few days it seemed a vacation of a lifetime, but on the 6th day Canal became ill.
I woke up with a headache one morning. We had gone to breakfast to see if I could get some water, get some juice, try some food, feel better, and then when we came back to the room, it actually hit us a lot stronger, and we smelled the smell of chemicals.
She got progressively worse. Then her boyfriend, Tom Schwander, started feeling it too. They say they were sweating, drooling, dizzy, nauseous. It wouldn't go away. Neither would the smell in their hotel room.
We saw a housekeeper outside and called her in to see if she could come in. She walked maybe 5-6 feet into the room and turned around and said, "I'm not doing that," and then got on her walkie-talkie to the front desk and said, "Something's going on with this room." She refused to come in and clean it.
Kaylin and Tom had seen someone spraying plants near the air conditioner outside their room. They assumed it was pesticide, but the hotel wouldn't say what it was. They switched rooms twice. It didn't help.
It progressed over the rest of our trip and then over the course of a couple weeks after.
A couple of weeks?
Yeah. The abdominal cramping and the GI upset lasted for a few weeks.
And you said drooling?
Yeah, drooling.
Sweat?
Bad sweat, tearing.
Dizzy?
Dizzy, nauseous. Yeah, and the abdominal cramping was the worst. That was the hardest symptom to deal with. It was just so much pain.
Back in Colorado, Canal's physician diagnosed her with organophosphate poisoning. Schwander's doctors suspect the same thing. Heavily regulated and in some cases banned in the U.S., organophosphates are man-made chemicals found in insecticides. Exposure can cause increased saliva, tear production, diarrhea, nausea, sweating, confusion, and death. The couple says they still have occasional symptoms, and they are most concerned about their future health. Even after filing a lawsuit, they still do not know what exactly poisoned them.
Honestly, all I wanted was the chemical name. That is all I ever wanted. I could care less about the money if I can save my own life later. And him too. It's what happened to him, what happened to me, what is it that we can do at this point?
Jim, not only will Bahia Resorts not answer any of our questions, but the company put out a statement saying all this reporting is causing the company to suffer a great discredit, they write, damage to its image and reputation. But more importantly, the company says serious insults and threats are being made to our more than 15,000 employees and their families, who are the company's main asset and to whom we cannot remain on the sidelines. Tom Schwander, the man you just saw in that video, is an ambulance director, a trained EMT. Jim, he has no doubt that he believes he was poisoned by pesticides when he was in this same resort 1 year ago this month.
There's some interesting minimum coincidence there, Drew Griffin, on top of the story. Thanks very much. Still to come, CNN obtained stunning new video of a dangerously close encounter between Russian and U.S. Navy warships. The U.S. calling this an aggressive act by Russia. You could see there just how close they came. Custody, suspected of planning an attack on New York's Times Square. Sources telling CNN the suspect was looking into buying grenades and firearms. He also allegedly talked about killing police and government officials. The FBI and the NYPD teamed up in an operation to arrest that man on Thursday. He is due in federal court later this afternoon. A source tells us there is no longer any imminent threat. And thanks so much to you for joining me today. I'm Jim Sciutto in Washington at this hour with Kate Baldwin. Coming up, she's got a big interview with Senator Bernie Sanders, candidate for 2020. Her show starts right now.